Good day, students, and welcome to this session for Research Methods in Education. I am your lecturer for today, and I am Dr. Zaid Wahid, and we'll be looking at the literature review and sampling. So, if you have any questions, then you are more than welcome to email me. This is my email address. And it's with regards to questions for this particular topic. So, the literature review. Now, when you think of the literature review, you are probably overwhelmed with the fact that there are certain amount of information that is available through the various sources, and it's quite important for you to sit down and visualize how this literature review might look like. So you are probably confronted with a puzzle, and you have all these various pieces, and you probably feel that this puzzle cannot really materialize without them fitting together, and obviously that is correct. So we'll go through the whole process of the literature review, and we'll look at certain concepts in relation to it, and try to assist you with your review of the available literature for your research project. Now, the literature review is very important for your research project because it will actually assist you in refining the research questions that you have already formulated. And it will assist you with regards to adapting it in line with the available literature. Now, when we're looking at the literature, we know that it is a representation of the results of scholarship or academic research on a particular subject. And there are, of course, different sources available, each with their strengths and weaknesses. When we're looking at primary sources, we know that that's information that has come directly from an individual or particular party. So we refer to as, the old saying, it's straight from the horse's mouth. It hasn't been analyzed or summarized by anyone else but the original source. And then we're looking at secondary sources, and this is information that is originally presented elsewhere. And when we're looking at these two sources, it's quite important for you to determine which sources you will use with regards to developing your literature review. So when we're looking at primary sources, we could, for instance, look at government documents or technical reports or statistics or speeches or diaries. So that's coming directly from the particular source, the individual, or, as I mentioned, can be an entity, organization. And when we're looking at secondary sources, we're looking at biographies or dictionaries or encyclopedias or even the review articles and textbooks. Now, in terms of review articles, we're looking at the fact that some individuals, they would have looked at a range of other literature, and usually you would find articles in this manner where you find an individual, he or she has reviewed literature over the last 5-10 years to make it more concise for the reader, especially those individuals who are keen on studying the particular topic at hand. Now, in terms of a journal article may also take on both primary or secondary source factors due to the fact that an individual might be producing a new form of conceptual article, but obviously adapting it in line with existing frameworks in place. So in some instances, when we're looking at secondary sources could also become primary sources, but that also depends on the topic at hand. For instance, also if we're looking at history, in education, then an individual, for instance, would be writing up his or her narrative with regards to events that happen over a period of time. So it very much depends on the context of the study, but with the review articles, they are very much, well, rather they would be considered as secondary sources. Okay, so when we're looking at the types of sources, we also look at the quality of the sources. So some sources may be considered as suspect, while some secondary sources may be considered as excellent. Now, generally, in any research article, you will find that authors, they would provide the particular limitations and weaknesses of their research. And that's quite important, because usually when journal articles are required to, or rather authors are required to present or have their research published, they are required to indicate any form of limitation or weakness in their research. Otherwise, if the research is presented without any form of limitation or weakness, one could question the unrealistic claims that may be present in this particular research. Now, when you're thinking of your own study, it's quite important to take into consideration the fact that your argument always needs to be supported by the available literature. And that's why you need to develop a sense of critical awareness of what you are reading and also what you are writing. Now, in terms of what you are reading, you need to question the particular source at hand. You need to take into account whether this article is a credible article, and who are the authors, or who is the author writing this article. Otherwise, it could just be someone's opinion. And if it's someone's opinion, you then need to take into consideration whether there's any vested interest at hand. Now, Wikipedia, although many would argue that Wikipedia is not a credible or a reliable reference, and in some instances resource, because of the fact that some of the information could easily be altered, it can actually be used as an a platform for you to think more broadly about your specific topic, and it's also a resource that may provide you with other available literature. Let's say, for instance, you want to study education management, and you will find out that there obviously is a page in Wikipedia, but you won't take into consideration the text that's included in for that specific topic without reading the available references. So at the end, sorry, at the bottom of the page, you will always find the available references, and that's also a good starting point to look at with regards to your topic. So Wikipedia in that regard can be considered as an important resource, but just always take into account the credibility associated with the text with Wikipedia. So, back to what I was talking to you about, having a sense of critical awareness. You need to have this awareness about the particular, articles or publications that you are reading on. Book chapters and books obviously may differ from journal articles, but because of the fact that you find many predatory publishers in the global context, it's quite you need to be quite cautious about using such articles as a resource, particularly with regards to unrealistic claims made in these articles. Now, usually on every university website, the Department of Higher Education and Training provides a list of credible journal articles. And Taylor and Francis and Elsevier are probably the most popular and credible, publishers available in the international context. Springer would be another. And you can also always refer to the journals available already under these publishers' website. So have a look at Taylor and Francis, and also have a look at Elsevier and then Springer. And then there's also Emerald that you can have a look at. And there's an opportunity for you to search for available journal articles, or searching for your particular topic, and that would lead to other journals under that particular publisher. So just be very cautious about the sources that you are using for your own study, because you don't want to use or compile a comprehensive literature review and you've used information from suspicious or unworthy not unworthy but suspect journals out there. Okay, so when you're thinking of the literature review, you probably feel that it basically means that I need to summarize a lot of information. That is not necessarily the case, due to the fact that anyone can essentially summarize any form of literature. The difficult part comes in when you actually have to analyze and you have to synthesize the available literature. And analysis and synthesis is far more difficult than just merely summarizing the available literature that you have. So when we're looking at analyzing, you need to break down the available literature and try to make sense of it. So your ability to conceptualize the available literature in line with the context that you find your research study in is quite important. When you're looking at the table, when you're looking at the chair, or when you're looking at this house over here, this Lego house, when you're analyzing, you're breaking it down and you're trying to analyze every last part that led to the construction of this house or table or chair and so forth. And when you are analyzing, as I mentioned, you need to have the ability to conceptualize what you are reading and how it relates to other particular topics at hand. When you are synthesizing, that is also an important part that we looked at. When you are synthesizing, you are bringing elements together to ensure that there is some so that you're able to relate these topics and that you're able to establish something new. So just back to what I was saying about analyzing, you're breaking it down, and when you're synthesizing, you are bringing it together and you're relating it to form something new. So it is not a copy and paste exercise, and as I mentioned, it's not just summarizing a bunch of text and thinking, okay, I've now completed my literature review. That is not what a literature review is. A literature review entails that you include some form of summary, but you analyze that summary and you synthesize it. You try to make sense of it. Now, a literature review, in a way, it's linked to the way you tell a story. So when you're looking at the story, your story has to have a beginning, it needs to have a middle, and it needs to have an end, with lots of connections between one part and another. So there's synthesis again in this regard. So you outline issues at the beginning and you provide analysis and synthesis in the middle. So when you're starting off with your literature review, you start off by introducing the topic, highlighting the fact that the literature before has not really addressed this issue that you're looking at, and then you analyze it, and you bring in a range of arguments, and then you also synthesize it. So once you have tied up and ended your literature review, you need to take into consideration, once you've summarized the issues, look at the differences, look at the paradoxes, look at any form of dilemmas and questions that have not yet been resolved, because that is what your literature review should essentially be looking at. So once you've now conceptualized your story, you can also look at creating a storyboard with your literature review, where, for instance, you have this topic and you start making linkages. Let's say, for instance, you want to investigate unemployment or poverty in South Africa. Then start off on your board, you write, for instance, unemployment in South Africa, and then you bring in various concepts. So you link unemployment, and you bring in poverty, and then you bring in crime, and then you try to make sense of crime, and then you do some research about crime, you do some research of poverty, you do some research of unemployment, and you try to make some connections. So is there a connection between crime and poverty and unemployment? So you need to ask yourself critically these questions. And that's why I said earlier that you need to develop this critical awareness of what you are reading, and obviously always trying to make sense of the available literature. So once you have your storyboard, it will give you a more concise and clearer picture in terms of where you are heading with your literature. So try to find themes and try to find disagreements that may be prevalent amongst scholars, and any form of discontinuities and breaks that may be reached after you have analyzed the literature. Okay, so back to the story. So as I mentioned earlier, you start off with the introduction. For instance, you can begin by saying that although your area of interest is clearly a matter of concern, researchers have tended not to focus on it. So there's a gap in the available literature. The middle of the story is the establishment of what people are actually saying and how they are disagreeing or agreeing. And then the end will come with a summing up and moving on to the reasons for doing your own thesis. So why are you actually pursuing this particular study in line with the available literature that you've already read? And it comes back to the previous slide where I mentioned that your research questions might also be altered in line with the literature that you have now read. Now, the research questions are not cast in stone. They may be adapted continuously as you read more, and as you read more, you feel that, okay, this research question can actually be adapted in line with the available literature. And once you've done that, you are able then to bring in the pieces together and able to actually, as I mentioned, relate every piece together so that they're able to fit and that they are very much interrelated. So you will constantly ask the question, does this piece go here or there? And what can we tell from these several pieces that seem to fit together? It's also important because if there's a missing piece over here, it will help you to identify what you still need to read up and what you need to review. Now there are obvious tips with regards to the literature review. Now, because of the fact that it's so comprehensive, there's so much text available in the local and global context. And when you are reading an article, you feel, this is a lot of information that I need to read, and how do I actually ensure that that I've read through this, and does it actually relate to my study? it's important for you to develop specific strategies, and one of the strategies is by looking at the abstract and conclusion. Once you've read through the abstract and you felt okay, because the abstract looks at the problem, it looks at how the study has been addressed, and then once you're looking at the conclusion, you're also looking at what the author looked at, and then what the author highlighted in terms of recommendations for your study, and that could also be seen as an impetus for you to want to do your specific research. And that's generally how people start their research. They look at the recommendations that are made by academics or scholars in a specific field, because when we're looking at even publishing in a journal editors, they want to find out whether your study is addressing a problem that hasn't been addressed before, or whether it's contributing towards an existing problem, and what is unique about your study. So read through the abstract first and then read through the conclusion. This applies to journal articles. Okay. You can survey, you can skim through the whole piece just to try to make sense of it. And as I mentioned again, once you've read through the abstract and conclusion, and you feel that okay, this study actually relates to your study, there are obvious other tips that you can look at besides just skimming. So you can search for keywords in the actual article. I do that sometimes when I feel that okay, I want to find out whether this article relates to my study, and I search using the electronic version of the article. I search for keywords and I try to link those keywords to my study, and I feel, and once I've read through those concepts and I feel that this is a worthy article in line with my study, then I'll read through the whole article at least twice. So stick to the questions that are important to you. Again, is the study, or rather is this article relevant to my study? That's very important. And as I mentioned, read the whole piece again. You can do it fairly quickly. And then the last thing that you need to do is you need to recall what was mentioned in the articles. Okay, and we'll come back to that last part in the next few slides. So organizing is very important with regards to your literature review and your research project in general. It's quite important for you to make notes of your reading, so you can use a Word document, and if you have the electronic article available, book chapter or book that you will be looking at, you could easily just copy and paste some of the key or important concepts or text onto this Word document. Obviously you need to reference the available sources. So use a Word document, and then as I mentioned earlier, you can copy the text available in the Word document, and ensure that you have a specific folder. I usually use Google Drive, so so I will have a folder for let's say an article that I'm writing, or a book chapter, or a book, and then I'll have my folder will include the article that I'm writing. So I'll have a template, and then I'll have another folder, and in that folder I will have journal articles or books, or a book chapter or book chapters in that specific folder. So use Google Drive or Dropbox, because nowadays it's important to store your information on a cloud system, because you don't know when you might need that later on. So that's just important with regards to organizing, and it ties in what I mentioned earlier about recalling what was in the piece, because once you've included the important parts in this Word document, you can always recall what that author said, and just be cognizant of the fact that you need to include a list of references, because it can be quite challenging to include this text, and then you need to find out now where's that that source, where's that article that you read before. So always reference and include your references in the Word document. That is one approach that you can look at. We'll be looking at another approach as well. Okay, and then searching information. As you know, Google Scholar is the most widely used platform available. And once you use Google Scholar and you type in certain keywords, or you can maybe even type your own research question, it will give you a range of journal articles available, or books or book chapters. Okay, and so these are some of the sources. Google Scholar is one source, and then CPUT also has the interlibrary loan, and you will find that there are some publishers that require you to pay to download an article, and in that regard, it's important for you to complete the interlibrary loan on CPUT's website. I think you find it under library services, and then there should be an option with regards to interlibrary loan, and then you can just request that the librarian provides you with that article or book chapter or book, because I know that with Taylor and Francis there are numerous articles that you would have to pay. The same with Elsevier, the same with Emerald, Springer, and so forth. Okay, and then another source could be that you could use is ERIC, which stands for the Education Resources Information Center. And ERIC is actually funded by the United States Department of Education, so it's quite a large platform. And again, you can use it to search for publications that, or rather topics or even concepts that you want to look at. And then it's also important for you to have a reference manager. I think this ties in what I mentioned earlier about, instead of including the references in your actual Word document, you can also use reference managers like Mendeley or RefWorks. They are quite popular. And with ERIC, for instance, you can actually export a citation to Mendeley or RefWorks, and then you will have that reference available for that particular program. Mendeley is quite popular amongst many South African students. So you can use ERIC, or I think even with Google Scholar you can stand corrected, but you can export the publication to this particular program, and then once you are ready to include all these references, then you would use Mendeley to export all those references to your Word document. Okay, so that's just some information with regards to organizing your literature review. Now, two common problems that students are confronted with include the following. You can't find enough information, or there is just too much information. I think we did, to a large extent, cover some of this, but we'll also be looking at how we can address this information, or rather these important problems. Now, in terms of the first problem, you can't find information. It's important not to limit your search by a very precise word when you may find some very interesting information. So in other words, although you type in unemployment, but then when you type in unemployment, you find a range of concepts like poverty, like crime, and so forth. And that's what I mentioned to you earlier about trying to make the linkages. It's better to try to make some form of connection than just being consumed with just one concept. Obviously, depending on what study you're looking at, in some instances, in some instances, you will find out that your study hasn't really been examined before thoroughly. So you need to look at various concepts that are related to that specific concept and then try to make that connection. Okay. Then in terms of you having too much information, it's important to sieve through the available information. You will find that a lot of the articles that you have available might not even relate to your study, and so therefore it's important for you to distinguish what is important and what is irrelevant for your literature review. So it's a sieving process. Okay, plagiarism is also a big issue, especially with regards to the literature review. And occasionally students are tempted to either pass off the work of someone else and then, take ownership of that. That is, it's unethical. And you can actually get in a lot of trouble by plagiarizing the work of others. I know at other universities you can get kicked out for 5 years, especially at postgraduate level. At CPUT, there's a disciplinary procedure. You will receive 0 automatically for your research project, and then it's taken further up with management. So try to avoid any form of plagiarism. Your supervisor will be able to assist you with submitting your research project through Turnitin, and because SaferSign is it's not really a comprehensive platform with regards to identifying plagiarism. Turnitin is much more comprehensive and much larger, and so therefore Turnitin would be the more appropriate tool to be used to identify any form of plagiarism that might be picked up in your research project. And with Turnitin as a plagiarism tool, it also highlights how you can actually improve on your own text, because if you're just copying and pasting without making sense of the text, then it will pick that up. So it will help you with rephrasing certain concepts or certain sentences that you need to rephrase. Just another tip for you: when you're writing and you've now used a resource, if you right click on a word, there is an option where you can choose synonym. So when you click on synonym, it will give you a range of words to choose from. So for instance, instead of using like the word occasionally, the synonym could be generally. Okay, so that's just a tip for you when you are busy reviewing the available literature, and always reference the available text. Okay, so if it's quoted text from the author, if it's directly from the author, you will always include the page number. Okay, that's very important. Okay, so I'm not going to speak too much about that. That's just some plagiarism with regards to the literature review. Okay, so we've now completed the literature review section, and we'll be starting with sampling. This isn't really a long section, so we'll be going over this quite briefly. Obviously, you need to read through the chapters in line with the literature review and sampling, because I won't cover every last concept for you. It's important for you to read through everything. I'm covering the gist of sampling and literature review to ensure that you are better prepared for your research project. Okay, so there's this assumption that you are taking your group or groups for your research from a manageable sample, which is then seen as a a representation of a larger population. So with sampling, especially in the field of education, we don't generalize, and so therefore your sampling, or rather your sample, will not be seen as a representation of the general populace. But that will also depend on the type of paradigm that you use in your study. For instance, if you're looking at an interpretivist research paradigm, then generally we don't generalize our findings with a wider within the wider context. But with experimental research, you would use a theory or hypothesis, and you try to prove this hypothesis. But in education, that's not usually the case. Usually, we follow an interpretivist or constructivist paradigm. Okay, so just in terms of sampling, of course, the sample may not be representative, and therefore there may be selection bias of one kind or another. There are many ways in which one can ensure that the sample is representative of the wider population. And one way is by looking at the random sample. So a random sample is a process in the same way that names could be picked up from a hat. However, it is not also good enough for the sample just to be randomly taken. Okay. Then we're looking at convenience samples. Convenience samples have many problems associated with it if you are expecting to generalize, and as I mentioned, we don't generalize. However, to take a true random sample, you would have to ensure that you were drawing a large enough subset of the population so that the chance of getting a distorted picture was reduced to the minimum. So here we're looking at 1,000, 1,000 participants for a research project. But obviously, in your research project, you won't include such a large sample. I think generally we included up to a maximum of 5. So 5 participants in your study. So already you can see that your study would not conform to an experimental paradigm. It's more of an interpretivist paradigm where you won't be generalizing your findings. So a way of improving a sample's representativeness is to stratify it, and by taking a stratified sample, you ensure that the sample you are taking reflects in important ways the characteristics of an actual population. So you look at certain criteria. For instance, if you're looking at teachers, then you'd be looking at specific criteria, the fact that they have some form of qualification. They might have a BA degree as an example, or you could also look at the amount of experience together with the qualifications that these individuals might have. Okay, and then we have the snowball sample, which involves the respondent telling the researcher who the next respondent might be, and the respondent doing the same, and so on. With purpose of sampling, which involves simply the pursuit of the kind of person in whom the research is interested, professes no representativeness. Okay, so just back in terms of what I was mentioning earlier, but in experimental research, the sample would be seen as a representative, rather be seen as a representation of the larger population. But with interpretive research, we don't carry this connotation because we don't generalize. Okay, so that's just a brief. We're just looking briefly at sampling. And in conclusion, okay, so when you're looking at your literature review, it's important to ensure that you are really telling a story. Okay, it's not copy and paste, and it's not just summarizing, but it is analyzing and synthesizing. And when you're looking at sampling, it's important to ensure that you are familiar with the research paradigm that informs your study. So, as I mentioned, in education, you would follow an interpretivist paradigm or constructivist paradigm, and based on your paradigm, you are not trying to ensure that your results or your findings um, would be able to be rather replicated in another study, okay, because of the fact that your population is quite small. Okay, so that is the end of the lesson for the literature review and sampling, and I hope that this session provided you with some insight in terms of assisting you with compiling your literature review and selecting the appropriate sample for your research project. Okay, so I wish you all the best with your project, and again, if there are any questions, you have my email address as well. Okay, so have a good day. Goodbye.